About Harry. Chapter 4. Struggles at Work. I swear this child is more often in our bed than in ours. Ginny welcomed him when back from his run at 7:30, sulking slightly. Sunrise was sitting in her high chair, mixing intently with her spooner porridge, a good part of it, on her face and around her plate. Siri, eat up, don't play with your food, Harry reprimanded her, and then, turning to Ginny, he kissed her forehead. She had a nightmare, come on. It happens so often, she said, pouring some coffee in a mug for him. She just wants to sleep in our bed. You always spoil her so much. She was right. Harry spoiled her very much, and he was aware of it. He wanted to always see a smile on her face, running the risk of spoiling her, as Ginny constantly reminded him. He endeavored severity, but it was difficult. Sunrise, in an innate instinct, knew how to work on him. A wrinkling of nose, a wobble of lips, a shade of ear, and he was ready to give in immediately to any of her whims. Thankfully, there was Ginny intervening with, "We don't want any brat," when such a moment occurred, to establish order. Harry sat down, taking the mug to his mouth, cherishing the bitter flavor of the dark coffee, while she was serving him breakfast. She seemed in earnest. It's always that dream about the bad bloke. Ginny sat down likewise, and wiped Sunrise's face with her bib, sporting a skeptic frown. "I bet it's all the school's fault," she muttered disapprovingly. Sunrise had begun to go to a kindergarten that year. Previously, Molly and Arthur had taken care of her while they were at work. Harry and Ginny, however, wanted her to start socializing with children of her own age, so one had to be chosen. It hadn't been easy. Like for every child brought up, they fell straight into the same argument. Harry wanted a muggle one, Ginny one for magical people. But as all the previous arguments, Harry ended up being the winner. Ginny could prevail on him on most of their disagreements, but she never managed on this one. Harry was adamant. He didn't want his children to be spoiled or treated differently only because children of Harry Potter. And since there was the opportunity to make them grow up in an environment where they could actually be as anybody else, he was all for it. He couldn't and wouldn't deprive them of Hogwarts, but the rest of their education he insisted on being between muggles. Ginny couldn't forgive him, and didn't lose a chance to complain about it. "I don't see how it could be the case," he replied, attacking his breakfast while starving after the exercise. "They tell her strange stories," she said, frowning and helping Sunrise with the porridge. Harry raised his eyebrows, quizzical. "What do you mean?" "Yesterday, when I was picking her up, they were recounting a tale, so I waited for them to finish," she started explaining, leaning close to him conspiratorially. "I couldn't believe it! It was gross!" Harry halted eating, very much surprised at this. "What did you say?" "Apparently, it was about some kind of wolf," she said, gesticulating, "who wanted to eat a little girl." Harry started to comprehend, and to have confirmation of his suspicion, asked, "Young, naive, with a red cap kind of girl?" "Exactly!" she exclaimed, and then looking at him darkly, "Do you know it?" Harry repressed a smile, and, curious to understand where she wanted to get, gestured her to go on, getting back to his breakfast. "This wolf, instead of eating her straight away, ate his auntie first." "Grandma," he corrected, unable to stop himself. But Ginny, too carried away with her tale, continued. "Whatever," she just said. "And then he actually toyed with the little girl, answering various probing questions, which is very perverse if you think about it, and then she ate her wool, like wool," she exclaimed, scandalized. Harry was finding very hard by then to repress a laugh, while Sunrise had stopped completely her eating to look at Ginny mesmerized. And then a kind of huntsman came and slashed the wolf's stomach open without so much of a charm, releasing the girl and the grandma, who in the meanwhile were still alive. Concluding this sentence, she had such a disgusted face that Harry couldn't contain himself any longer and burst out in a vigorous laugh straight away, followed by Sunrise that bounced up and down in her high chair with mirth. "What?" Ginny bellowed over the laugh, quite upset. "It's only a muggle story," he said, once managed to calm down his amusement, "and a very famous one at that." "Well, it's nonsensical and gruesome and not adapted for a child." Harry, finishing the last mouthful of his meal, stood up to take his place to the sink. "Don't worry, Ginny. I grew up with that story. James and Albus too. Hermione as well, and we all survived well enough without major traumas. I dare say Siri will do the same." "I like Little Red Riding Hood, Mommy," Sunrise chirped with a beam. Harry smiled and caressed her head. "Little Red Riding Hood, sweetie," he corrected her. "See?" turning to Ginny. "No major traumas." "Fine!" she yelled at Morose. "But nevertheless, she must learn to sleep in her bed," continued Obstinate, eager to win at least one battle that morning. "All right, next time we'll be merciless," Harry conceded mockingly. "I'll have a shower, and then I'm off. I'll try to be back early tonight." "It would be high time," she said wearily. At work, he was busier than ever. Only 2 weeks back, a dark wizard had been tracked and ambushed. He was a sick individual with a twisted mind who enjoyed experimenting dark magic on corpses, chopping them up and putting them together in a mix and match manner. 5 of his best hours had been on the capture, but the situation had started to go downhill quite fast as the reason of all this chopping had come to light. The guy was building an infantry army with an enhanced strength. He hadn't had time to build more than a handful, but quite enough to catch them by surprise and overwhelm them quickly. When he got there with forces, already 3 of his colleagues had perished, and the 2 remaining were struggling with fire to keep the infantry back. Eventually, they managed to overcome them, but the Dark Wizard had fled, and the squadron from the Ministry had to be called to cancel memories that needed to be cancelled and to dispose the monstrous infantry's body. From then on, everything started to be hectic. New staff had to be taken on and trained straight away to fill the vacancies, and that was a cumbersome task, as Harry always wanted to make the choice personally. He oversaw the tests, observed them, participated to interviews, explaining at length the nature of the job. He wanted to make sure they knew what they were getting into and evaluate their strengths. Many people applied every time there was an opening. Several, unfortunately, were all but serious. Only wanted to get to see him up close or have the chance to talk to him. Those were the moments in which his forbearance was most tried. Therefore, after many of these irksome encounters, he had adopted a simple strategy to scheme candidates: a 5 miles run. The ones who couldn't make it were out. It helped, but it still took months, if not years, to have a well-trained new Auror. It was indeed hard, but the worst had been to deal with his colleague's death. It was always tough, especially witnessing the grief of husbands and wives, relatives and children during funerals to which he always made a point to attend. He couldn't help but picture Ginny in the same situation if something happened to him, and his heart was always constricted. Even if he tried hard, could barely have the detachment required. Outside, he looked stern and serious as it was expected, but inside, it was a completely different matter altogether. It was impossible not to get fond of his colleagues, despite his reticence to befriend them too much. It was always challenging, But from Lily's accident, everything had worsened. It hadn't been the only time that he had to participate to such funerals, but since her departure, it weighed more on his shoulder and couldn't quite get rid of a feeling of guilt connected to every of those deaths. It was him, after all, who ordered them there. He realized it was nonsensical to carry those faults, but nevertheless they were there, luring in a corner of him. He was starting to consider whether it would have been better to quit his job. There wasn't any reason for him to keep working. They had money enough to allow them a luxurious life, even without any steady entrance. And they weren't living a luxurious life at all, as they didn't feel the need. He could have enjoyed Sunrise childhood more. He was taking very careful precaution to make sure this was going to be the last child fathered by him, and he would be out of danger. It was a tempting perspective in many respects. Yet, a small part of him was always reminding that after all the people who had lost their life to help him survive and defeat Voldemort, he ought to keep fighting dark magic to make up. He was in debt and had to pay it off. He was always very careful not to bring his discomfort at home, but nevertheless it had crept on the family in the evening. Sunrise was unusually whimpering, and Ginny, very much afflicted in seeing so low and sensing the reason, was affectionate and caring. He had taken him a few days to realize, but when he did, made his best to shake it off. His priority was to see his girls happy and carefree. Nonetheless, he had so much going on between his hands at work that he was always getting at home quite late, sometimes finding Sunrise already asleep. That day, he would have asked Carola to help him with trainings. It wasn't right, after all, for Ginny to have the whole responsibility of Sunrise, handful as she was. "I'll get dinner on my way back, so you don't have to cook, all right?" he said, stroking her head affectionately. "As you want, but take your present. I got Witch Weekly 2 days ago, and I still hadn't time to open it. Tonight, for a change, I'd like to be able to sit on the sofa and not crawling on the rug with Sunrise." Harry grinned, kissing her head and Sunrise's, who had taken back her porridge exploration, and made upstairs for a quick shower. Chapter 5. Thank God for Hermione. "I swear I hate that kindergarten!" Ginny welcomed him that evening. Harry tilted his head on one side, wondering if he was indeed doomed to receive the same welcome until Sunrise's 11th birthday. "Another inappropriate tale?" he asked warily, struggling to free himself from his jacket, as Sunrise, as soon the door had opened, had flung himself in his arms and had pelted him with already 3 daddies in a row. She was now trying to catch his attention, jimpering away excitingly, stumbling on difficult words, and fidgeting so much he was having difficulties in keeping her up. "Not quite," she answered, pecking him, her frown still on. "Daddy, I made a flower!" Sunrise chirped in his ear. "Did you?" "Yes, Daddy, it's beautiful." "Beautiful, sweetie," he corrected her. "Do you want to show it to me?" he said, putting her down, at which she darted purposely toward the living room to retrieve the precious artwork. Harry smiled softened, as always seeing his child running, her round legs scampering and her curls dancing up and down around her head. "They think I'm a single mother." Ginny brought him back to their conversation. "Today they offer me to keep Sunrise for an extra hour, since I'm alone," she added, scolding. "How come did they think that?" "Search me," she said, shrugging. "Perhaps because they have never seen you. It's always me dropping and picking her up." "Oh, well, you can always tell them, can't you?" he said, as Sunrise was running back with the paper in her hand and the glee on her face, ready to climb on him again. He took her up, walking toward the kitchen, trying to make out the flower from the mass of colorful lines on the paper. "It's beautiful, sweetie," he exclaimed, putting her in her high chair. Actually, I think I've seen something similar made from a very famous muggle artist. You must be a genius. As he kissed her hair. I told them, Ginny frowned, opening the boxes with the food he had taken home. But I've seen from their faces that they didn't believe me. Harry took knives and forks from a drawer and started to set up the table. Who cares what they think? I care what they think, she said thunderously. I don't want them to think something strange. Harry burst out laughing. Something strange? Like you bore an illegitimate child outside wedlock? Ginny didn't answer, knotting a bib around Sunrise's neck, but her lips pinched into a bead. We are in the 2000s, not in the 50s, he continued, setting glasses. Nobody cares about those things anymore, especially in London. Charlie is not married and has a son. You never had a problem with that? The silence was even more marked, notwithstanding Sunrise's unstoppable chatting, and Harry, seeing her frown, relented. He sat close to her and took her chin to spin her face toward him. I'll go and pick her up tomorrow, all right? He offered, kissing her forehead. She brightened straight away. Could you do that? You should be there by 5 at latest, she asked, picking up her fork and starting to eat her takeaway quite cheerfully. By 5, Sunrise repeated, attacking clumsily the food on her plate. I'll make it work, he said, absent-minded. He was thinking, besides, that it was about time for him to pay a visit to the families of his parish colleagues. He wasn't required of him, only something human he felt doing. It was not going to be fun, quite the opposite, but he couldn't forget the sorrow on those faces at the funeral, and he hoped a visit from him would have been appreciated. He didn't want them to feel forgotten by the ministry. He would have taken the chance the next day, just before going to pick Sunrise up. He didn't share it with Ginny. He had told her the gist of what happened the same day, but he hadn't dwelled in particulars, and he hadn't spoke about it again not to trouble her. His priority was to see her happy and serene. He had written to Hermione instead. There was this oppression of spirit in him that needed to be lifted somehow. Since she was in Romania, it happened very often. He didn't have his listener anymore, and writing wasn't just the same. Ted had divined straight away there was something not quite right, but he wasn't the kind of person who forced the confidence, and Harry wasn't inclined to make him his confidant. He was only 23 after all. He needed somebody his own age. He needed Hermione. After dinner, a few days after the event, he took parchment and quill. Sunrise was sleeping, and Ginny was chatting with Molly through the fire. He went to the living room not to be disturbed and sat down, pondering on what to write. Putting his uneasiness on paper would have been difficult. They weren't writing to each other very often. It seemed too stiff and formal, and Harry wasn't that good with words. He had never needed to voice what was troubling him in the past, because for some mysterious reasons she had always known it. She had always done the talking for him, and he had always felt better afterwards. They had seen each other quite often when she had been in England, and every single time he had hoped her sentiment towards him had quenched. He just couldn't help himself being affectionate with her. He loved to hug and kiss her. He loved to keep her hand. He longed for that friendly contact possible only with her. But since her declaration, there wasn't any more the same happy-go-lucky feeling. It was always drenched by awareness. He couldn't read hearts nor gestures. He couldn't say if the sentiment was still there. Therefore, at the end of every holiday, he asked Ted, more observant by nature, "Do you think, Hermione?" He was never able to conclude the sentence, but Ted, who had never needed him to talk to understand his meaning, "Yes, she still does," would answer every time, filling him with disappointment. How long it took for a person to stop to love when no hope is offered. If Ginny would leave me, would I ever stop loving her? And with a sinking sensation in his abdomen, he thought, no, I would never stop to love her. He hoped with all his heart it wasn't the same for Hermione. She was stronger than him, more intelligent, with a whole soul and a free of torment's mind. Perhaps she could do what she would never have been able to do. He fiddled with the quill, pondering for a good quarter of an hour, with Ginny Blythe's chats in background, and, in the end, he dipped it in the ink and started to write. When finished, he realized everything had been written, but what was bothering him? He was full of daily trifles, but not about his colleagues. He sighed. It was impossible for him to do more than that. He decided to send it anyway. At least he had the comfort of an answer to wait for. He received it a day later. Dear Harry, who do you think you are fooling? I read the newspaper. Be at 1 o'clock in front of the fire tonight. Love, Hermione. He had laughed a relieved laugh. That night, they talked until 3 o'clock in the morning, and the next day, though knackered by lack of sleep, he felt better, more positive, and less guilty. Thank God for Hermione. I want you to tell them we are married, Ginny said, bringing him back to their conversation. How in the hell should I do that? Harry blurted out. Hell! Sunrise repeated with enthusiasm, at which Ginny looked darkly at him. I cannot go there and announce that me and you are legally married. It would be ridiculous, he continued, bewildered. Ginny rolled her eyes. Slip it casually in the conversation, Harry. All right, he muttered darkly, returning his attention to his plate. Sunrise, at that moment, slammed her small fist, clenching her spoon on her high chair, for some reason with an indignant air. 30 by 5, she bellowed, pointing the spoon toward him. And then she pointed to Ginny and bellowed with the same patronizing air. Mommy, ridiculous! Ginny pulled a face as Harry roared in a vigorous laugh. It's confirmed, he stammered between fits of laughter. Our daughter is a genius. Chapter 6. Comforting Visits. The morning flew. His mind already on the afternoon. The families to visit were 3. One of the hour was a single young man living by himself, an only son, and his family was shattered. The father was trying to bear it courageously, repeating himself many times over that his son had done his duty bravely and he could be proud of him. He has always been very brave, he told Harry in front of a glass of hard whiskey, since Hogwarts days. He was in Gryffindor, you know, like yourself. He had always made us proud. He continued, hunched on the glass, fixed on its content and emptying it with a single gulp. Harry encouraged this train of thought, as there wasn't any other consolation at hand. The mother was in a pitiful state. She barely acknowledged him, mumbling distractedly some excuses for her listlessness. She was sitting in an armchair close to the window, her gaze not leaving a picture of a child on the mantelpiece, a veil of tears glazing her eyes. He couldn't offer any consolation to her neither, and left the house soon after, accompanied by the father's steady mumbled repetition, "Thank you, son, for your visit. Appreciated." The second hour was a woman recently married. Her husband, now a widower, was living in a small flat on the outskirts of Liverpool. The house was a mess, mirroring the state of his owner. His red eyes underlined his sleeplessness, and the empty bottles of alcohol scattered about his will to escape grief. Harry wished ardently to be more capable with words, to be able to say something to lessen that discomfort, but he knew how it was. there aren't really many words that can do that. So instead, they chatted about Quidditch, about his job, they told each other anecdotes about hangovers, and discussed at length about the best mead sold in the Hogshead. And Harry, when parting, was sorry not to be able to give him his address in case he needed to take out his mind from the gloom, but promised himself to check the situation again in a week or two. The guy thanked him for the visit, his eyes already darkening with the loneliness that was waiting for him once the door would close. And when Harry said goodbye, he was already sunk in it and barely answered. Harry dragged himself courageously to the last house, a widow with an 8-year-old son. When the door opened, the woman was smiling behind it and welcomed him cordially. She had a bright sweater on, and her hair were pinned tidily on the side of her head. She was a few years younger than him, with an oval face and sweet manners. The boy, who had come to see who was at the door, gaped in seeing him and was left speechless while the woman was leading him in the living room. The room was clean, and the light outside, already fading in the short wintry days, was gleaming in from the wide window. "You are Harry Potter, aren't you?" the little boy asked innocently, as her mother, who was serving him tea with some handmade biscuits, addressed him in an apologetic smile. He smiled back reassuringly and nodded to the boy. "What's your name?" "I'm Chris." "Nice to meet you, Chris," he said, shaking his small hand. "You thought you know who, didn't you?" "Yeah," he answered awkwardly. He always felt the need to explain that he had done nothing special, and many people had helped him. He didn't like to take a whole merit of it, but there wasn't any point in doing it at that moment, with a child. Chris was silent for a few moments, observing him in awe, and then, producing from his pocket a stack of cards, exclaimed proudly, "I've got your chocolate card!" riffling in it for the right one. "I swapped it with Merlin. I had 3 of those." He looked intently at the card, where a younger Harry could be seen from the frame, and added, "My dad told me he was going to have it signed for me." "I can sign it now, if you want," he offered. The mum interposed. "You don't have to, you know. I imagine how bothering it can be. People surely ask you continuously for it. Chris, leave Mr. Potter alone," she concluded, turning to his son, who lowered his eyes disappointed. "It's not a problem," he reassured her, smiling. "Take a quill," he encouraged the boy. Chris shot from the living room, and a fast stamping could be heard on the stairs. "I'm sorry," the woman said apologetically. "He's a good boy, and has always been very excited about his dad working with you." "It's fine," he said. "It's not a trouble. It's only a signature. It's worthless, really." He sneered as the boy was already flying back in the room, flushed with the quill and the card. He signed it, and the boy, having gained some confidence, chatted gaily. "Do you know that with your signature can be sold for 20 gold galleons?" Harry laughed, thinking about his previous sentence that proved to be wrong. "Really? Sell it then," he said, giving the card back to him. "No way! I'll keep it!" the boy said, mesmerized, looking at the card with such glee that Harry had to reconsider again his previous sentence. "Do you know what? If you find another one, send it to me in my office, and I'll sign it for you, so you can sell that one." "Would you really?" Chris asked, excited. "Sure." His mother at that moment interjected. "That's quite enough, Chris. You had your signature, now go and play in the garden like a good boy, and let us talk." The boy agreed cheerfully, and thanking him, he darted outside in search of his friends, eager to show his new treasured possession. The silence swallowed them as soon as the boy was gone. The woman Asked if he wanted some milk in the tea. He declined. The woman looked outside the window. No sound disturbed the hush. Harry, again, was at loss for words, and watching her thought about Ginny. What would he have liked her to hear in the same situation? He didn't know. The shoulders of the woman quivered slightly as her eyes filled with tears. Harry lowered his gaze, awkward, unsure whether it was something best to pretend not to notice, being somewhat a private show of grief. He stirred his tea needlessly, as there wasn't any sugar in it. "He was a good man," she said feebly. Harry put down his cup and watched her concernedly. The quiver grew more marked. She was clutching very hard the serviette in her lap, as if to subdue it. "I'm sorry," she muttered, tears starting to escape her eyes. "It's all right." The sobbing started to show itself, and Harry wondered uneasy what was best to do. Hesitantly, he left his place and sat close to her. His instinct was prompting him to hug her, but it was hardly appropriated. He didn't even know the woman. And yet, his mind didn't offer him an alternative. So then, tentatively, rested an arm around her shoulder, fearing in the meanwhile a sharp reprimand. That didn't arrive. As soon as his hand was there, the woman got close to him and snuggled up under his arm, sobbing harder, her head on his chest. He sat back on the sofa, keeping this unknown woman close to him, like he would have done with his wife. But he knew there wasn't anything wrong in that, because this is what he would have liked Ginny to be able to receive in the same situation. So he caressed her hair gently, lulling as best as he could that woman that was sharing with him her sorrow. "I feel so lonely," she muttered under her voice. "I know," he only said. No words were added. Her tears altered by degrees, but it was a long while before Harry felt right to break that embrace. The kindergarten was a white shed square building with a rainbow painted on it. Harry and Ginny had visited a few, and this one had been chosen because it had a nice garden at the back of the building with some trees, all barren now, but in spring it would have been lush and green. He wanted his daughter to be able to play outside when the season permitted it. He walked through the entrance, and children's drawings were hung all around, giving a great air of cheerfulness. He lingered undecided. He didn't know where Sunrise classroom was. It was already 5:15. After the gloomy afternoon, to lift his spirit, he had visited George at the joke shop. Jude was still working there, happily married now, not with George, but still enjoying herself freely when the husband was away for business, with George, mostly. She was a nice sort of girl, and he had spent some enjoyable time with them, joking and laughing. Therefore, he was a bit late, but at least in a good mood. A woman with silvery hair came out of a classroom, carrying some toys. She flinched in surprise seeing him. "May I help you?" she asked. "Please," he said, walking toward her. "I'm Sunrise Potter's father. I came to pick her up." She looked at him up and down studiously. "Have you got an ID?" He faltered. He actually had Muggles' papers. Mingling so much with them was necessary. All of them had them, including Ginny, but he never carried them around as totally useless in his everyday life. "I'm afraid I haven't got it with me," he replied. "I'm sorry, but without an ID..." As the woman was speaking, a familiar loud hoot echoed in the corridor. "Daddy!" It resounded everywhere in the empty hall, bouncing against all the walls and getting to him amplified, just as a full of enthusiasm little girl ran toward him, followed by a flustered young woman. Harry's face lighted up, seeing her arms outstretched in his direction, her round and chubby legs, her joyful glee. One couldn't help but melt on the spot receiving such reception, as if he had been away months instead of only a few hours. Her overflowing joy was contagious, and he found himself smiling openly and stooping down to lift her up. "Is he enough as AD?" he asked at the woman, who was simpering now. "I suppose so," she replied, shrugging her shoulders as Sunrise was already in an unstoppable flow of "Daddy!" in a frenzy of excitement. The other young woman caught up. "Sunrise, you must not run away in this way," she reproached her, panting. "It's Daddy," Sunrise chirped back as an explanation. "I can see that. You look exactly alike," she cooed, smiling to him and outstretching her hand. "I'm Miranda," she introduced herself. "Sunrise's teacher." "Harry," he said, squeezing the head off her, deducting an odd pleasure in being able to introduce himself, a kind of a seldom experience for him. "Sunrise's father," he smiled. He caught a shifty peep to his left hand, holding Sunrise, followed by a simper and a slight blush. In a flash, it became clear why they thought Ginny was single. He had seen exactly the same peep from her aunt when he was a boy many times before. He was always followed by some remarks or other to his uncle when the person objected to the peep was out of earshot. Suddenly, he remembered Ginny's request, and seeing the blush on Miranda's face seemed, despite the embarrass felt, necessary to fulfill. "My wife couldn't come today, so I came instead," he stammered sheepishly. Miranda's lips pinched in a O shape, her eyes darting again to his bare left hand. "Where is Mommy?" Sunrise asked. "At work, sweetie." "I want to show you my class, Daddy!" she chirped, starting to squirm in his arm to be put down. He complied straight away to avoid the risk of her tumbling down, and she, clutching his hand firmly, pulled him forcefully through the corridor, followed by Miranda. The room was very colorful and unexpectedly tidy. A low table with some very small chairs was in the middle, and Sunrise insisted for Harry to sit on one of those, utterly inadequate sitting considering the respective sizes. However, he did as he was asked, or better ordered, by a very self-assured Sunrise. She started to scurry around the room, taking toys she wanted him to see, describing them with such a fervor that all her words were tumbled and incomprehensible. Miranda let her have her own way for a bit, but then she made her sit down on the table, giving her a sheet of paper and some crayons. "Why don't you make a drawing for Daddy?" she asked her. "I'm sure he'd like one." "Very much," he said, starting to feel crumbs rising on his sacrificed legs. He stood up, as Sunrise had grasped greedily a yellow crayon, bellowing proudly to the world the color of it. She was already working energetically on the paper when Harry followed the teacher on her desk under her invitation. The chair offered was much more adapted to his stature. "I'm glad to have you here, actually," she started in saying. "It was some time I wanted to speak with your—" She paused, peeping again at his hand. "Wife," she resumed, with a slight arching of eyebrows that made almost Harry wanting to excuse the lack of the muggle ornament that marked him as legally married. "She always ran away so quickly when she comes to pick her up that I never had the chance." Harry scolded inside at Ginny's nonsensical behavior that was surely only imputed to her dislike of muggle education. "Do you get to see her often?" she inquired shiftily. Harry was puzzled. Do you mean my wife? I meant the child. Well, yeah, of course. We live all together. He hesitated and then pressed on. In the same house. But not receiving an answer, he gabbled. We are married. I mean, with my wife. I see, was the only unconvinced answer of Miranda. We haven't seen you before, so... I work long hours, he explained, feeling more awkward by the minute. May I ask the nature of your job? He slurred, racking his brain for a valid answer. I chuck criminals in prison, went lamely for in the end. In the law enforcement, do you mean? She asked, interested. Kinda. I see, she said, staring, waiting for him to continue, but not receiving any kind of further explanation, resumed her talk with a wave of her hand. Well, getting back to Sunrise, she said, businesslike. She's a very bright child, full of energy and well advanced for her age. A bit stubborn and bossy time to time, but essentially a good-hearted, well-behaved child. Harry nodded, looking fleetingly at Sunrise, who was still working furiously on her paper. She has also got a sharp imagination, always coming out with strange tales of heads popping from the fire and magic wands and objects flying, she said, rolling her eyes and laughing coquettishly. Yeah, we read her a lot of bedtime stories, he muttered, floundered. I thought that much. Harry drew an internal breath of relief. What concerned me is that recently she started to be very moody. Harry frowned. What do you mean? For example, today she whimpered almost the whole afternoon. She halted a second, and then looking fixedly in his eyes, she added, for no apparent reason. Harry was silent, trying to understand the possible reason. He looked again at Sunrise, who seemed anything but anguished, and Miranda, reading his thought, added, a couple of hours ago, she stopped suddenly, and she resumed playing as nothing ever happened. That's bizarre, he said under his voice, his eyes still on Sunrise. Maybe she had a little quarrel with one of her friends, he hazarded. It could have been an hypothesis, but it hasn't been the only time, she said slowly, interlinking her fingers on the desk. Harry watched her for a better insight. It happens a few times already. Since when? More or less a couple of weeks. Harry was at loss and couldn't think to any possible explanation besides bullying, but somehow he couldn't imagine Sunrise being bullied by 2-year-old children. If anything, he was worried about her bossiness toward the other children. I wonder if by any chance something happened at home, she asked inquisitorily. Harry stared back with a blank expression. Like? I don't know. Something not pleasant. She pressed on, suddenly stern. Harry frowned again, giving his own thought, but nothing came to his mind. It was a long time he didn't have a proper argument with Ginny, and usually they made sure not to let it happen in front of Sunrise. He hadn't been in the best of mood lately, but he had tried not to let it leak anymore. And anyway, she was always as gay as a lark when he was at home. She wasn't a whining child, and in the last few weeks the only moment she had been seen crying was in one of her tantrums or just after the accident of his colleagues. But it was understandable then. Even Ginny had been affected by his mood, and the child surely had channeled the bad vibes of the evening. But she could not in any possible way be grieving steadily for that. He hadn't talked of it in front of her, and anyway she was too young still to understand what it meant and to be affected by it. It must be something here, because at home she's always fine, he said pensively. But I'll ask my wife, in case she noticed anything. But then, musing on it, quickly discarded the idea, envisaging the sore consequences of such a communication. Nothing would have stopped her in her anti-mangle kindergarten quest, and for no reason at all, since it was with any probabilities only some stupid quarrels between children over some toys or a silliness of that kind.
Daddy, I finished!
Sunrise bellowed shrilly, waving the sheet of paper in the air. They left no long after that. Sunrise, proud of her artistic exploit, took his hand. The teacher managed to shift his gaze again a couple of times over the same hand before they could get out, and he couldn't help to notice with the corner of his eye Miranda joining conspiratorially the woman who had welcomed him, surely another teacher, and the two starting a fast and vigorous whispering that soared in him an instant flash. "This is ridiculous," he scolded through clenched teeth, refusing to let the silliness of it get to him.
Ridiculous!
Sunrise echoed joyfully.